After Larry Hagman's passing, his oceanfront estate in Ojai, California, was eventually sold to a wealthy couple from San Francisco, Mark and Elaine Whitmore. They had always admired Hagman's career, from his iconic role as J.R. Ewing in Dallas to his eccentric lifestyle, and were drawn to the estate's sprawling acreage, Mediterranean design, and panoramic views of the valley. To them, it was the perfect retreat from city life, a place where they could relax and entertain friends while living in the shadow of Hollywood history. But almost from the beginning, the Whitmores noticed that the house felt strangely alive. Elaine first sensed it. On their very first night, she awoke to the faint sound of muffled laughter echoing through the halls, like guests mingling at a party long since ended. She thought perhaps it was the wind catching in the courtyard arches. But when she got up to check, the house was silent, empty, and cold. Mark experienced it differently. While unpacking boxes in Larry's old library, he swore he smelled cigar smoke, though neither of them smoked. The scent would come and go without warning, lingering in the corners of the room, almost as if someone had been sitting there moments before. As the days went on, the sense of unease deepened. Friends invited for a weekend getaway commented that the house felt too heavy, as if the walls themselves were watching. Several of them claimed to see a tall man in a white cowboy hat standing by the terrace at dusk, yet when they looked again, he had vanished. One night during a dinner party, all the lights in the house flickered and dimmed just as Mark raised a glass for a toast. A guest joked, "Guess JR doesn't approve of the wine." The laugh that followed was nervous, cut short by the sudden crash of a framed portrait falling from the hallway wall. By the second month, Elaine refused to enter the master bedroom alone. She insisted that she felt someone sitting on the edge of the bed when she tried to sleep, a pressure that pressed down just enough to make her breath hitch. Mark, growing more skeptical yet equally unnerved, found himself waking up at precisely 3:15 a.m. every night, always to the faint creak of footsteps pacing along the upstairs hallway. One evening, while watching Dallas reruns in the den, the television abruptly shut off by itself. When it flicked back on, the screen displayed only static, but behind the hiss, both swore they heard a man's drawling voice, sharp and commanding, "This is still my house." Word began to spread among neighbors that the Whitmores were having trouble. Some locals whispered that Hagman had loved his estate too much to ever leave, that his flamboyant energy had soaked into the walls. Others claimed that Hagman had often joked he'd haunt the place just to make sure the next owners treated it right. Now, as the Whitmores lived out their nights in unease, they wondered if his joke had turned into something more chillingly real. The Whitmores had always prided themselves on being rational, grounded people. Mark, a tech investor, dealt in logic and statistics. Elaine, a gallery curator, believed in the weight of history but not in restless spirits. Yet the longer they stayed in the house, the more their once sturdy certainty began to crumble. During the day, the estate looked picture-perfect. The sun fell warmly on its terracotta roof tiles, bougainvillea spilled down the white stucco walls, and the infinity pool shimmered like liquid glass. Guests would marvel at the views that stretched out across Ojai Valley, praising the tranquility. But when twilight bled into night, the house seemed to shed its welcoming mask. The rooms grew unnaturally cold after sundown. Not just chilly, but bone-deep cold, as if the house itself exhaled frost from its foundations. Elaine often wrapped herself in shawls, though the weather outside was still summer. The windows would fog slightly, though no one had touched them, and when she pressed her hand to the glass, the condensation smeared into streaks as though brushed by unseen fingers. The library was the first room that truly frightened them. It had been Hagman's private domain, a place lined floor to ceiling with dark oak shelves, leather-bound volumes, and memorabilia from his career. A grand wooden desk dominated the center, polished to a high sheen, with his initials discreetly carved into the side. One evening, Mark sat at the desk with a glass of bourbon, determined to work through emails while Elaine was upstairs. As he typed, the familiar scent of cigar smoke filled the room again, thicker this time, curling around him as if someone sat just beyond his peripheral vision. He looked up, expecting to see nothing, but instead caught the faint reflection in the glass cabinet doors. A tall man, seated casually in one of the armchairs, legs crossed, hat shadowing his face. Mark froze, blinking hard. When he turned around, the chair was empty. Yet the air still seemed disturbed, as if someone had just leaned forward and stood up. His drink trembled in his hand, tiny ripples breaking across the bourbon's surface. Later, when he told Elaine, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. "I've felt him too," she admitted quietly. "He sits on the bed sometimes. He's watching." By the third month, the house developed a voice of its own. The Whitmores began to hear whispers drifting through the hallways at night, low, indistinct, yet undeniably human. They weren't the sharp noises of a settling house, nor the scrape of tree branches on windows. They were conversations, sometimes laughter, sometimes muttering, sometimes a single commanding word that hung in the air before fading into silence. One night, unable to sleep, Elaine stepped into the hallway. The floor was cold under her bare feet, the air heavy. She followed the sound of whispers down toward the dining room. At first, she thought she heard music, faint strains of a piano, soft and cheerful. But as she moved closer, the music cut off abruptly, like a hand had slammed the lid of the piano shut. The dining room was dark, yet she could make out the long polished table gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Every chair had been pulled slightly away from the table, as though invisible guests had just stood to leave. Elaine clutched the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. She backed away slowly, refusing to turn her back to the room until she was halfway up the stairs. The Whitmores began to notice that their friends no longer accepted invitations to visit. At first, the excuses seemed harmless: busy schedules, work trips, last-minute emergencies. But one couple, close friends from San Francisco, finally admitted after a weekend stay that they couldn't return. "We woke up at 3 every night," the woman confessed over the phone. "We heard someone walking down the hall. At first, we thought it was Mark, but when we looked out, there was no one. And the lights, Elaine, the lights in our room flickered on and off like someone was playing with the switch. I'm sorry, but we don't feel comfortable there." Elaine listened, heart sinking. She hadn't told them about her own experiences, yet they described the same things. It was confirmation, not imagination. The disturbances escalated. Drawers opened on their own, doors slammed shut with no draft to explain them. And once, most disturbingly, the pool's surface began to churn violently while Mark swam alone. He scrambled out, dripping and shaken, staring at the water calming itself back into stillness, as though nothing had ever happened. Elaine grew pale and sleepless, her once bright demeanor fading under the constant tension. She spent long hours staring at the master bedroom doorway, waiting for the figure she swore entered each night. Mark, increasingly frayed, tried to dismiss it all as stress, but even he couldn't ignore the way the house seemed to pulse with unseen energy. The Whitmores began to wonder if Larry Hagman, larger than life in fame and personality, had truly refused to leave the stage. His beloved estate now his eternal theater. Mark had always been the skeptic. Even as the strange events piled one upon another, he clung to logic like a lifeline. He told himself it was stress, the adjustment to a new home, the weight of history pressing down on them. But after the incident at the pool, his composure began to crack. He noticed the way Elaine's eyes grew hollow from lack of sleep, the way her voice trembled when she spoke about the figure she saw near the bed. He realized, with quiet dread, that neither of them could go on pretending this was normal. So he decided to act. One bright Saturday morning, with sunlight streaming across the property, Mark called in a contractor to inspect the wiring, convinced the flickering lights were a symptom of faulty circuits. The electrician spent hours in the attic and behind the panels, emerging at last with a shrug. "House is clean," he said. "Modern wiring, no issues at all. Whatever's going on with your lights, it isn't electrical." That explanation, or lack thereof, left them both more unsettled than reassured. Elaine, quietly desperate, took matters further. Through a friend in Los Angeles, she arranged for a medium to visit the estate. A woman in her 60s named Marjorie. She arrived one afternoon in flowing linen, her voice calm but her eyes sharp with the weight of experience. From the moment she stepped through the carved wooden doorway, Marjorie's expression shifted. She walked slowly, running her fingers along the cool plaster walls as though feeling for hidden veins. "He loved this house," she murmured. "He built it as a sanctuary, a stage, a reflection of himself. He is still here. Not angry, not malicious, but unwilling to leave." Elaine's hands tightened on her lap. "Can you help him move on?" Marjorie only shook her head. "It isn't always that simple. Some spirits cling because they don't realize time has passed. Others because they enjoy the power of being remembered." That evening, the three of them sat in the library where Mark had seen the reflection. Marjorie closed her eyes, whispered a series of words that felt older than the house itself, and asked aloud, "Larry, are you here with us?" For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then the faintest sound would creaking, the leather chair shifting. And then, so soft that Elaine wasn't sure she hadn't imagined it, a man's chuckle drifted through the air. Smooth, amused, unmistakably human. Mark felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He stood abruptly, knocking over his glass of bourbon. The liquid spread across the floor like a dark stain, and in that spreading pool, the scent of cigar smoke thickened. Marjorie opened her eyes slowly. "He is here," she said, voice steady. "And he isn't going anywhere." After the séance, the house seemed to take notice of them in new ways, as if aware of their attempts to interfere. The temperature shifts grew more violent. Warm evenings outside gave way to bone-chilling air indoors, to the point that their breath misted in the hallways. Doors that once creaked open now slammed shut with the force of anger, rattling the frames. Elaine's paintings, which she had hung carefully in the sitting room, were found each morning tilted or knocked from their hooks. One afternoon, she walked in to find every canvas turned neatly to face the wall, as though the house itself rejected her attempts at beauty. But the worst came late at night. Elaine would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, only to feel the mattress dip beside her, slow and deliberate, as if someone had sat down. The pressure would remain for minutes at a time, accompanied by the faint smell of cologne, sharp, musky, old-fashioned. She would shut her eyes tight, afraid that if she looked, she would see the outline of a man leaning in to study her. Mark, in turn, heard voices more clearly now. They weren't whispers anymore but fragments of sentences, spoken in a commanding drawl. Sometimes they came from the study, sometimes from the terrace, once even from the empty pool deck. He couldn't always make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Authority, confidence, the sound of someone accustomed to being listened to. When Mark and Elaine cautiously began asking around the neighborhood, the stories they heard only added fuel to their dread. An elderly neighbor recalled how Hagman used to host lavish gatherings at the estate, parties that went late into the night with music, laughter, and endless drinks. He said once, the neighbor told them with a shake of his head, that he'd haunt the place himself just to keep the party going. None of us thought he meant it. Another neighbor whispered that workers who had been hired to renovate the gardens after Hagman's passing refused to stay after dark. One claimed to have seen a man in a cowboy hat standing on the terrace, watching silently. When he looked again, she said, the man was gone, but the glass door still bore the imprint of a hand pressed against it. By winter, the Whitmores' lives had unraveled into exhaustion and unease. Their friends avoided the house. Their work suffered from sleepless nights. Even the staff they had hired, cleaners, gardeners, maintenance crews, had begun to quit, one by one, muttering excuses that were thin but unwilling to say the truth out loud. And the house only grew bolder. On a stormy night in December, the couple sat together in the living room, rain lashing against the wide glass doors. As thunder rolled across the valley, the stereo system switched on by itself, blaring music from another era big band swing, cheerful and lively. The volume rose steadily until the walls seemed to shake with it. Mark leapt up, fumbling with the controls, pulling plugs from sockets. Yet the music continued, relentless, echoing through every room. Elaine covered her ears, tears streaking her face, while above the music, they both heard it. Laughter. Deep, rich, rolling laughter, like that of a man who owned the room, the house, the very night itself. And then, as suddenly as it began, the music cut off. Silence returned. Only the rain remained. The Whitmores sat frozen, drenched in fear, realizing what they could no longer deny. The estate wasn't theirs. It had never truly belonged to them. It was still Larry Hagman's, and he had no intention of leaving. The Whitmores began to fracture under the weight of the house. Elaine, once refined and meticulous, wandered the rooms late into the night, her hair unkempt, her eyes searching corners as if expecting someone to step forward. She whispered apologies to the empty air, muttering that they didn't mean to intrude, as though she was speaking directly to Hagman himself. Mark grew harder, angrier. He slammed doors, shouted at the walls, and demanded the spirit leave them alone. But every time he raised his voice, the house seemed to answer. The chandeliers swayed though the air was still, doors rattled in their frames, and once while Mark was in the kitchen the gas burners flared to life on their own, blue flames hissing until he scrambled to shut them off. The house wasn't just haunted, it was reacting. One night, Elaine found herself in the library again, drawn there without understanding why. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight seeping in through the windows. She sat in Hagman's old chair, the leather worn, the wood creaking under her weight. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt watched, yes, but the fear had twisted into something else. A strange acceptance. The cigar smoke swirled faintly, the scent curling around her like an embrace. She whispered into the silence, "Do you want us gone?" For a moment, there was nothing. And then the stereo across the room clicked on by itself, the speakers whispering static before settling on a familiar sound. A man's slow, easy laugh. Elaine's chest tightened. She closed her eyes. She didn't scream. She only whispered back, "I know." Mark reached his breaking point 2 weeks later. After another night of voices pacing the halls, he stormed out into the courtyard just before dawn. His fists clenched, his voice hoarse, he shouted into the empty air, "This isn't your house anymore. You're dead. Leave us alone." The words echoed across the valley. And then, as if in answer, every light in the house blazed on at once: hallways, bathrooms, the great chandelier in the entryway. The windows vibrated. A deep groaning reverberated through the foundation, and Mark felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. Elaine, rushing out in her nightgown, grabbed his arm. "Stop," she begged. "You'll only make him stronger." But it was too late. From the terrace above, a shadow appeared, tall, broad, unmistakable in outline. A cowboy hat tilted low, shoulders relaxed in that familiar posture of confidence. The figure didn't move. It only stood, gazing down at them, framed against the pale morning light. Mark blinked and the figure was gone. But the lights in the house stayed burning until sunrise. By spring, the Whitmores could no longer deny the truth. The estate was magnificent, yes, but it did not belong to them. They had become tenants in a theater where the show had never ended. Larry Hagman's presence, larger than life in fame, personality, and ego, still lingered, filling every corridor with his laughter, his smoke, his commanding energy. One evening, they packed their suitcases, leaving much behind. They didn't announce their departure to friends or neighbors. They simply locked the heavy front door one last time and drove down the long winding road into the valley, leaving the house silent and waiting. The estate sat vacant for months. Realtors struggled to keep it listed. Potential buyers came, toured the property, marveled at the view, yet few returned for a second look. Some claimed the house felt too alive. Others, more blunt, admitted they felt watched the entire time they were inside. At night, locals swore they still saw lights flickering across the estate. From the road, some claimed to hear faint music drifting on the wind, and always just before midnight the low echo of laughter rolling across the hills. The Whitmores never spoke publicly about their experience. They sold the house quietly, moved back to San Francisco, and refused to answer questions. Elaine, however, confided to a single friend that she sometimes woke in the middle of the night, still smelling cigar smoke, as if the spirit hadn't entirely let her go. And so, The estate remained sun-drenched by day, brooding and watchful by night. A house that belonged, and perhaps would always belong, to Larry Hagman. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?